Let's turn to a major story that people have been talking about throughout the day. And this is new guidance that has been released by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. That's the EHCR, not to be mistaken for the ECHR, by the way, which many people do get the wrong way round. But the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, after a number of months having submitted its guidance to government ministers have sat on what has now become clear on the back of last year's ruling by the Supreme Court that biological sex ruled the day. So if you are going into a changing room, if you're going to a bathroom, if you're going into any kind of a space where there are single-sex uses, so protections for men and women, it is as defined by your biological sex. Now, most people will think that that's just common sense, but it has taken a long time for government to get round to publishing that guidance. Why it's taken so long, I don't know, but we'll be asking those questions throughout the next couple of hours. It is a conversation that has stoked many people up and down the country. Can a man have a penis? A woman have a penis, for example, is a question that is often asked. Politicians can't seem to answer it. Should men who identify as women be allowed in women, same, single-sex spaces? The trans community will argue that, yes, they should be able to, because that's how they identify, that's who they are, that's the body in which they belong in, that is the gender that they feel more comfortable in, and to say or suggest otherwise is against their human rights. Well, guidance today has been very, very clear that those single-sex spaces should be protected on the basis of biological sex. Well, there is a woman, a Wonder Woman, as I like to call her, who has been a huge advocate for protecting women's rights and protecting those single-sex spaces, particularly for women. She is a champion. She is someone that I am incredibly supportive of, and I'm so delighted that she joins me today. It is, of course, Sharon Davis, former Olympian and women's rights campaigner. Sharon, how are you? Can you hear me? Happy Friday.
I can hear you really well, Charlie. I'd like to say, actually, I quite like my men to have penises. It was a Freudian slip, so,
yes.
just so that everyone knows that.
One of many, I'm sure, throughout the evening. Don't worry, the night's young,
It's a sunny May day. We're allowed to be a bit happy, especially after yesterday.
Well, of course, but I mean, it is a Freudian slip, but it's so confusing, the whole sex. But is it confusing? It shouldn't be confusing. And today
it shouldn't be confusing.
But
it's been made deliberately confusing. I mean, what's frustrating really for all of us is that the law hasn't changed, right? The Supreme Court ruling back last April didn't bring in any new rules. It just clarified the law, how it applied to the Equality Act. I think where the confusion has come from, in 2011, guidance was written and badly worded. It used the word gender when it should have used the word sex, but it meant sex, which confused a lot of people. And then Stonewall took advantage of that and constantly misrepresented it across the board to everybody, including sports, of course. And so what women have had to do for the last, 10, 15 years is to scrabble to get our rights back again, to have the things that should never have been taken away from us in the first place. And obviously, the right to have single-sex bathrooms, changing rooms, and sport. Sport, everybody knows that if you're a male, you have a biological and physical advantage in sport. And therefore, a very mediocre male is going to be able to beat an elite female. And who in their right mind ever thought that was fair? Just because someone says, well, I feel like I'm something else. The problem is, where does it stop? If we turn around and say to people, okay, we're now going to accept that someone can feel like they're the different sex, where human beings cannot change their biological sex, at what point do we turn around and say, well, actually, I feel like a different age, and I'd now like to claim my pension, please? Or I'm actually really rubbish 15-year-old, but I want to race the under-12s because I'm not very good and I'm smaller than, and it's ridiculous. We have to deal with reality, and then we have to find ways to include everybody that's fair and kind. But we can't base laws for anything on feelings.
No, I think that most people, you would have thought absolutely agree with that. But the one body that didn't seem to agree with that is the Olympic Committee, who have allowed, correct me if I'm wrong, but have allowed trans athletes to compete.
They do, absolutely. Laurel Hubbard was the first, and as far as I know, probably one of the only ones. I mean, most of the trans athletes that have competed since then have actually competed, they've been women who identify as males, and they've been competing, but in the women's category. So at the last Olympic Games and the Winter Olympics that we just saw this year. We had 2, and we've had a couple of non-binary females. So they identify as non-binary, but they're biologically female. And the only way that they could be at those Olympic Games is by competing against other females, because otherwise they wouldn't even make the team. So, those are the only people. The biggest problem we've really had in international sport for quite a long time is DSD, differences of sexual development. So these are athletes who, for one reason or another were misdiagnosed when they were children, and female was written down on their passports or their birth certificates. And in fact, they were biological males because in most cases they had internal male genitalia. So they were able to compete for a very long time. And that happened because the IOC took away sex screening at the end of the 90s against all the wishes of female athletes who very much said we wanted to maintain and to carry on. And now, of course, it's been brought back. And at last, the IOC have decided to see the light, and we will have fair Olympic Games in LA.
But people will be asking, you're right, because this doesn't just happen overnight. The Olympic body committees and all the people that sit around the table and make these decisions about who can compete in what sort of sport or gender or sex or category or whatever it is, wording that people want to use. It doesn't just happen overnight. How has it got to a stage that campaigners, because it must be campaigners that have advocated for so long to allow biological men in women's sport? How have we got to it?
Well, one of the biggest reasons was that the IOC only invited transgender athletes to Lucerne to give them evidence. And then they invited very poor, scientists and doctors who weren't even specialists in the area of sports biology in to give evidence as well, who obviously had an agenda because they were trans-identifying anyway. They based their decisions on extremely poor science in the first place. 20 individuals self-reporting over a period of 20 years telling us that they got slower. I mean, we all got slower over 20 years. I'm a lot slower than I was 20 years ago.
I don't believe it.
And the only person that got faster, exactly. The only person that got faster, they decided was an outlier and they dropped from their study. I mean, it really was really poor science. Every result ever, throughout the whole of history shows us that there's a very big difference between male and female performance. And you cannot compare a mediocre male with an elite female. You have to compare, average with average or elite with elite. And that's what's good about this guidance. It does actually say, for the sake of sport, it has to be the average female versus the average male. In any sport that's sex affected, it has now to be based on sex, which is great. So that's a really, really big success for us. And obviously the Women's Sports Union, but we'd love everyone to come and help us support, because we know there's still going to be a battle to be had. But, it's now very clear that sport should be run on the lines of sex only. And I want to make sure everyone does sport. I'm sure you do. Sport is an amazing thing. It's been in my life forever. And I'm a true believer that it helps everyone's mental health as well as their physical health. And goodness, don't we need to be fitter and healthier? So we must find ways to include everybody. But it was the easy and lazy solution was to throw women's sport under the bus. And that's exactly what they did. Well, if this ever affected men's sport, if unfairness affected men's sport, Charlie, it was sorted out. So if we're talking about carbon shoes or shark skin swimsuits or Paralympians with blades that want to race in the Olympics, that was sorted out very quickly when it was going to affect men's sport and fairness in men's sport. When it came to women's sport, it just didn't matter. And that was what was really so heartbreaking after all the advances we've made.
Yeah, no, and you can completely imagine and sympathise totally. And that's at an elite level. But you're absolutely right. We want to see people in sports. We want to see people taking part in physical activity, whether that's just at the gym. And so does this guidance go far enough then? We've dealt with sort of the elite level sports with, we're talking about trans athletes, but when we're talking about your local leisure centre, where, you've got your changing rooms, traditionally you've got your male changing rooms and your female changing rooms, does this guidance give cover, do you think, to those employees where you might have someone who identifies as trans, so they could be biologically male, identifying as a trans woman, or they are a trans woman, and they want to use the facilities? Does this guidance provide the employees of those centres the adequate processes to say, okay, this is where you should be getting dressed, for example, or unchanged? It's not saying you can't use the facilities, but it's just giving those employees...
Absolutely.
Does it give this cover? Does this guidance go far enough to help those leisure centres?
That's probably where we've gone the most wrong. We've had 10 years where we could have been finding better solutions rather than doing what we've done. And now they will have to find better solutions. So it does say that no males should be in a facility that says girl, female or woman. That is only sex-based. So that is your changing rooms. That is your swimming class or whatever, if it's just being put on for women. particularly obviously competition at all levels, which is absolutely what it should have been. A lot of the sports were being very cowardly and they protected the elite, but they didn't protect everybody else. So they basically were saying, we'll protect you if you're good enough, but we're not going to protect you if you're not good enough, which was direct sex discrimination, of course. So where it's going to be difficult, is this sort of slight apprehension to ask people, which is ridiculous, right? So if a man walks into a woman's changing room, we're not allowed to ask. How are we supposed to get them out? But I have read the guidance quite deeply, and it contradicts itself in lots of places where it says you can ask, if it's physically obvious, and then in other places it says, but really you shouldn't because it's against somebody else's human rights, or it might make them feel awkward, or it might be harassment. So we're going to have to sort out that, because obviously you can't produce a law and then say that we can't give you the instrument to implement it. And the people that are going to be at the front line is, like you said, is the poor girl at the desk, at Virgin Active, who's going to have to say, I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to go into this, neutral changing room. But of course you can go in the gym, and of course you can call yourself whatever you like, and of course you can wear whatever you like, and I don't know any women that have a problem with that. What they have a problem with was their intimate spaces, their bathrooms, their changing rooms, their sports, their prisons, places where they're vulnerable, and where they feel like safeguarding is being risked. And I think what is really interesting statistic, and it's very rarely talked about, and it's really important that it's talked about, because, thank goodness for people like yourself and stations like yourself, but 60% of trans-identifying men, so trans women that are in prison, are in prison for sexual assault reasons. Only 18% of the male population in prison for sexual assault reasons. So to say that trans men are never a risk to women is not true.
No, I think that's a point that you've made, I think, before, which I've seen, and you're absolutely right to make it. And I just wanted to give you credit before we go any further, because it's a 300-page plus document, I think, and so most people are enjoying it.
Last night, heavy reading.
Heavy reading. But the question I also had was not just about the changing facilities, but also because you're absolutely right. I personally think that people who identify as trans have suffered quite a hard life, probably harder than most of us. It's difficult enough growing up in your own skin, let alone feeling that you actually identify as a man or a woman, depending on what body you're born in. You feel as though actually you've been born into the wrong body, you're the wrong gender. So having to come to terms with that and deal with that, I think, is a huge challenge for people. And I think that's why there needs to be absolutely the support for those people to ensure that, as you said, absolutely rightly said, that they should be able to use those facilities. But for me, the answer is just very simple, where we have, and I've read in the guidance, I haven't read all 300 pages, I must confess.
It's quite repetitive, I have to say.
But I was shocked actually by still the use of the word disabled bathrooms and disabled toilets. I thought we'd done away with that word and reverted them all rightly to accessible, because they're there for family changing facilities, baby changing facilities, as well as people that might need wheelchair access or have disabilities of any kind.
I suppose it's the automatic go-to in the fact that it can be a neutral space. So if you've got, a disability bathroom, it is used by both male and female people who are disabled. So therefore, it's an obvious solution to go, well, this is a neutral space. So therefore, it's the quick solution. And obviously, there is going to be some cost to this. What is very frustrating is that there was never a risk assessment or a cost that was ever talked about before women lost their rights. They were just taken away by stealth. Now we're given back what should never have been taken away from us. Everyone is talking about the cost of doing that. Well, you should have not done it in the first place. That's the whole point of this, really. So I think we do have to think outside of the box. Even in sport, we have to find places where we can have mixed teams, where it's safe, where people are prepared to, take the increased risk if they want to have mixed sex football teams. That's absolutely fine. I have no problem with any of that. As I said, I want people to do sport. My issue has always been that a team that's called women's team, or a competition that's called for women or for girls, it has to be for women and for girls. Women get 4%, 5% of the sponsorship dollar across the world. Men get the rest, right? 95% of all money in sport goes to men. We get less than 4% of primetime airtime for 51% of the population. Now, I'm not stupid. I do understand that there is supply and demand. I do understand that probably more men watch sport than women. However, that doesn't mean to say that we should just dispose of women's sport because of that.